Steel melts, and 24,000 gallons of aviation fluid melted the steel.
As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give.
Indeed, there was plenty of evidence of melted steel, including this, and this, molten spheres of iron, steel like Swiss cheese, and of course this. But over time, this melted steel story changed. Even today, the media report and many scientists believe that the steel melted. This is not true. And NIST said that the molten steel was irrelevant to the investigation of the collapse, since it does not provide conclusive information on the condition of the steel when the towers were standing. John Gross of NIST, who was at the yard observing plenty of evidence, denied its very existence.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so.
Except these firemen.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails.
And this eyewitness.
The fires got very intense down there and actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
And this architect.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
Molten iron in explosions is easily explained by incendiaries and explosives, but not by fires. So that evidence had to be ignored and denied. And instead we were told that it was a pancake collapse, which contradicted the Besant pile driver theory.
Then you had this sequential failure that took place where it all pancaked one after the other.
The result is what's called a progressive collapse, as each floor pancakes down onto the one below.
But the pancake collapse also couldn't explain how the core columns fell. And despite all the animations, entire floors collapsing are not what we observed. So let's review what the experts told us. There were explosions, there were no explosions. The fires melted the steel. The fires didn't melt the steel. The truss connection broke. The truss connection didn't break. The columns bowed out, the columns bowed in. Building 7 didn't free fall. Building 7 free fell. The sulfur came from the gypsum. Sulfur didn't come from the gypsum. Collapse was inevitable, although it's not inevitable. The experts can't melt steel with thermite, but a novice can. In all the theories we've been told by the media and institutional experts, their melted steel theory is wrong because those fires are too cold to melt that steel. Their crush-down, crush-up pile driver theory is wrong because it defies Newton's third law and doesn't match observation. The pancake theory is wrong because it defies momentum laws and cannot explain the fall of the core and does not match observation. And their aluminum sprinkler theory is wrong because there is no evidence to support it. And after years of study and millions of dollars, our government doesn't have any theory at all for the collapse, simply saying it was inevitable. And none of their theories can be demonstrated experimentally or explain the molten steel, the iron microspheres, the eutectic formations, free fall, uniform acceleration with no jolts, nanothermite, and much more. So what theory do you believe? Most people would rather believe the corporate media and mainstream experts, even if their theories are wrong and don't make sense. But if you have the courage to look at all the evidence and to independently think using basic laws of physics, you will clearly see the elephant the experts are desperately trying to hide. They want us to never forget 9/11, but also want us to never remember the uncomfortable evidence. Because the experts told us.
The investigation team has studied every possible scenario.
Except the controlled demolition scenario that best addresses all the evidence, and was clear that very first day before the experts had the chance to hide that elephant.
This was clearly, the way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned. This is not, it's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know.
So how did those towers come down? They were intentionally blown up. The obvious stares you in the face.
Here's Building 7 coming down second by second. You can see the gaining downward momentum. And you can put it on a plot of drop distance versus time. It fits the graph perfectly in the first 2.5 seconds, indicating the structure had to have been removed before the next floor came down. Meaning the building can't fall at free fall speed and do any other work because all of its gravitational potential has been converted into kinetic energy. It can't crush 40,000 tons of steel on its way down without slowing down. It did not slow down. It dropped as fast as a rock dropped off the top of the building.
Larry Silverstein, new leaseholder of the World Trade Center, regretfully declared that a decision was made to pull Building 7 by the end of the day, the last structure added to the World Trade Center complex. Let's hear Mr. Silverstein's actual words, delivered for our benefit in the 2002 PBS documentary, America Rebuilds.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Blast, shoot, blow, and pull are terms used in the demolition industry to refer to bringing down buildings, bridges, and other structures.
Because I actually blew the hospital down that I was born in.
Originally, we had figured to shoot it, let it drop straight down.
Then, watch Demolition Dynamics attempt a big blast.
And from Ground Zero's own post-disaster wrecking crew.
By mid-December, the Department of Design and Construction had leveled World Trade Center buildings 4 and 5.
Hello? Oh, we're getting ready to pull building 6.
This happened on 9/11. If this came down by explosive controlled demolition, it puts everything into question relative to the collapses of the other two buildings on 9/11. It's part of the same problem. Let's take a quick look at the Twin Towers, because the evidence is even far greater. And incredible amounts of pyroclastic-like dust from the pulverized concrete developing even before the gravitational potential has a chance to develop. This is very telling. We have squibs or explosions coming out, but you can see the explosions racing down 30 stories ahead of the supposed kind of pancaking collapse all the way down. Very violent explosions traveling at free fall speed. The debris goes 12 to 1,400 feet, lateral ejection. This is an organic, asymmetrical damage to the building from the planes and the fires, and yet we have complete symmetrical displacement. These buildings fell over in earthquakes. Their structural systems tend to hang together. You see what was a building down at the bottom. It doesn't decompose or dismember into its individual structural elements. The concrete is not pulverized to dust. Remember, buildings that collapse don't disintegrate into their core elements. Watch as you see this amazing quantity of heat propelling it in this cauliflower-like formation, typical of a volcano almost. You and I have a problem because the implications of this are staggering. If these buildings were brought down by explosive controlled demolition, then how, who, why? How'd they get away with it? How do you get instant acceleration of 55 miles an hour laterally in order to get 600 feet away? You need some other kind of energy other than a gravitational collapse. So this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the U.S. can accomplish. Extremely high-tech, only put out by Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore Labs very recently. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan.
Silverstein, a commercial real estate tycoon with international political connections, acquired a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center complex in the spring of 2001. Throughout the summer, he reworked the insurance policies on his new property, making sure that it was covered for acts of terrorism. Explicit in the lease agreement was Silverstein's right to rebuild the complex if it were destroyed. After 9/11, Mr. Silverstein fought his insurers in court to obtain double his policy limits for the destruction of his property, maintaining that the double hijacking constituted 2 disasters caused by terrorists, not just one. He won and was awarded over $7 billion, a magnificent return on his original $15 million investment.
In order to crush the lower section of the building, the top section would have to actually impact the lower section, and in so doing it would experience a jolt which is not observed. When you hit a nail with a hammer, the impact drives the nail into the wood, but it also slows the hammerhead. In the case of the North Tower, this did not happen. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, assumes that the falling section of the North Tower acted as a pile driver to destroy the core structure of the lower section of the building. However, the observation that the top section accelerated constantly downward contradicts this claim. The clear implication of the physics is that the falling section of the building is not actually crushing the lower section. It is falling into the rubble as the lower section of the building is being destroyed by other forces. To check whether this analysis is correct, let's do the same measurements for a known demolition. The Balzac-Vitry demolition is particularly interesting for our purposes, because instead of using explosives, the columns on the middle floors of the building are collapsed using hydraulics. The only destructive force thereafter is the impact of the upper section on the lower section of the building. Therefore, we know that crushing, not explosives, is what is destroying the building. From the data, we plot the velocity as a function of time. The slope of this kind of graph gives the acceleration. Deceleration means the downward velocity would be reduced, so the slope would have to turn around and actually rise left to right. If we look at the graph of velocity versus time, there is a downward slope at first. During this interval, the top section accelerates downward until the two sections collide. We can tell there is some resistance, because the downward acceleration is less than the acceleration of gravity. As the contact begins, the slope becomes less steep. However, when the two sections of the building fully engage, the slope of the graph turns around and actually rises, indicating that the downward velocity is decreasing. This is clear deceleration, just as we predicted. The graph of the Balzac-Vitry demolition is what one would also expect to see in the case of the North Tower of the World Trade Center, had the falling section been responsible for crushing the lower section of the building. The fact that the downward velocity continually increases tells us that the destruction we see is not due to crushing. Something other than gravitational collapse had to be at work to destroy the building. The Balzac-Vitry demolition illustrates another important conclusion. The impact destroys both sections of the building at the same time, which is why the demolition team initiated the process in the middle. This two-way destruction is a clear consequence of Newton's third law, which says that as bodies interact, the forces act equally in both directions. Had the top 12 floors of the North Tower actually crushed the lower section of the building, the falling block would have been destroyed by the same forces and at the same rate as the lower section, or even faster since the building was built progressively stronger at lower levels. At most, the top 12 floors might have destroyed an additional 12 floors, but the top section would have been consumed in the process, leaving nothing to crush the rest of the building.